Welcome to the Vikingskipshuset Museum here in Oslo. My name is Margaret. I am a guide here and I am delighted to take you around on this 15 to 20 minute tour of our wonderful museum here today. Right now I am standing in front of the Oseberg ship, which is one out of 3 ships that we have on display here in this museum. And as the name might imply, these ships are all Viking Age ships. But before we go further into that, I'd like to take us over here for a little bit. Because in order to know exactly what we're talking about, I'd like to just mention where and when the Viking Age was. The Viking Age is a historical period that we usually say lasted from around 750-ish AD until the middle thousands AD. So we got a 300-year period circa going there. And this is happening while the Middle Ages are happening in the rest of Europe. So the Viking Age actually is kind of going on in these countries here, which are today Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, Iceland, and parts of Finland. Now, one thing that I'd just like to say is that these countries that we know today, they didn't yet exist. So the Vikings that we talk about, they were not one unified people, but the Vikings referred to the people who lived in this area at that time. And these people, they were known for a lot of different things. They traded a lot, they farmed, they raided and they plundered, they stole, and they traveled a lot. And that is why I wanted to show you guys this map. Because if you see all these red dots, those are places that we know the Vikings have been. So one thing they loved to do was travel. And how could they do that efficiently? Well, by using ships. Like I said, this is the Oseberg ship that I'm standing in front of right now. It is named after the Oseberg farm, which is a modern farm located near the town of Tønsberg in Vestfold, Norway. So this ship is actually named after the modern place where it was found. It might have had a name in the Viking Age, but the Vikings didn't really write a lot of stuff down, so in that case, we don't know. But all these ships here in this museum have been named after the place where they were found. And this ship is pretty unique because here along the prow and also along the aft of the ship, we have magnificent carvings. This is a type of art style known as animal art, and it really flourishes during the Viking Age. We usually find them on jewelry and weaponry, and this is the only ship that's ever been discovered with this type of art on it. It is pretty magnificent, right? Now, this ship was not found in a place where you might think it would be natural to find an old ship. It's not found on a pier or by a beach. It was actually found pulled far onto shore and dug down in a huge mound. Those kinds of mounds we call grave mounds because, as you might have guessed, that means that this ship was part of a grave, a huge grave. Someone died who were obviously so important that one of the ways to honor them was to sacrifice one of the most important things they had, namely a huge ship. They built a little grave chamber aboard in the back of the ship, put the deceased there, and then filled the ship with a lot of other stuff, basically, what we call grave goods, that we think they put there in order to prepare the deceased for the afterlife, wherever that was. When this was done, they covered the entire ship and everything in it with dirt and soil until what remained was a huge mound, meaning that people have been aware that these were really rich, important people located in these graves. The size of the ship itself kind of signifies that the people aboard were most likely very important, influential, and rich. Because I want to stress the fact that these are not ordinary Viking graves. These are top-notch. And there are other things in these graves that indicate that this probably was most likely the case. One of them we're walking towards right now. This is the wagon from the Oseberg grave. It is wonderfully carved, just like the ship. I don't know if you can see all the details, but there are so many things happening here. Probably myths and different stories being told in these carvings. And this wagon is actually built to be disassembled. You could disassemble it, place it on a ship, go on a sea journey, and then when you got back to shore, you could reassemble it and have a transport device. There are, however, other things in this grave that kind of probably signifies a little bit of daily, everyday life. Because just like us today, the Vikings too had regular, everyday lives. One of those things was maybe this chest. I mean, you need storage, guys. You need someplace to put all your stuff. And why not in the grave too, right? So here is a wonderful chest that contained a lot of different things. We also over here have the headboard. And these were placed inside the burial chamber, and the deceased were put on these beds. And then we have one of the things here that are my absolute favorite in the whole museum. We have these leather shoes. Something to put on your feet, right? So you don't get cold. And these shoes have most likely been worn by actual Vikings. Even though they're behind a glass wall today, it's kind of like they're almost there. Obviously, and there is that fact, because we have these 3 sleds. These sleds, maybe they seem a bit too much. I mean, they already have a wagon. However, what happens in Scandinavia in the winter? It snows. It gets really hard to get around, but not if you have a sled. So this shows that most likely it was important for the people in this grave to be prepared for all seasons. We do have some things, though, that we don't know quite what are. These are over here, and today they are known as carved animal heads. They're kind of strange looking. They all have mouths opening and then teeth going down, like they're biting down on something. These were all found around the beds, and we know that there has been a rope going through their mouths. Maybe this means that the bed with the dead people put on top of it was kind of behind a barrier. So when people came into the grave chamber to put grave goods down, they would still be separated from the actual dead people. There are also some handles on these heads, which makes us believe that they most likely have also been made to carry. Maybe in processions or in ceremonies. We're not quite sure. Earlier, I mentioned that all the ships in this museum were found in graves. However, these ships weren't just grave ships. They actually had what you can kind of call lives before being buried. How do we know that? We know that because we have dated them, and we've also been able to date the graves. And what turns out is that all 3 ships actually differ from the grave with about 10 to 20 years, meaning that most likely these ships have been used. However, they could have just been built and then left there until a certain someone died. But we know that they've been used because the wood has swelled, meaning that the wood the ship is made of has expanded in contact with water and then contracted when becoming dry. Right now I am standing in front of the Gokstad ship, which was found on the Gokstad farm near what today is Sandefjord in Norway. This ship differs a little bit from Oseberg, the first one we saw, in that there are no carvings here, and the ship is also bigger. It is both longer and wider, in addition to being deeper, meaning that you have more space underneath the deck for things maybe like provisions for travel or trade goods like fur. A couple of years after this ship was excavated in the late 1800s, there was a World Fair in Chicago, and Norway's contribution to that World Fair was building a copy of this exact ship and sailing it over to North America. That ship sailed to New York from Bergen across the Atlantic in somewhere between 2 to 3 weeks, which means that this ship type, and maybe the Gokstad ship specifically, was built and is extremely well suited to long distance travel over large bodies of water. I mentioned earlier that these ships were found in mounds, in grave mounds, meaning that they were buried and they were left there for about 1,000 years. But what usually happens if you dig down a piece of wood and you leave it for 1,000 years? Well, it rots away. So how have these things survived? Luckily for us, there was a large amount of what we know as blue clay in the soil naturally, these 3 specific places where the ships were buried. Right now, I'm standing in front of the tuna ship, which is named after the place where it was found, known as Tuna. And when comparing it to the 2 others, it might not seem that impressive. That is because in this mound specifically, the blue clay was only underneath the ship. The rest of the soil the mound was constructed of was also very sandy, meaning that oxygen got through very quickly and it started to rot. So when this ship was found, this was the only thing that was left of it. However, grave mounds like these are relatively common in different parts of Scandinavia, but only some grave mounds have actually had traces of ships in them, because obviously they have rotted away. The fact that we've been able to find so many wooden artifacts in these graves are therefore largely thanks to that blue clay specifically. We don't think that these mounds were made in these places because of the blue clay, that this was intentional from the Vikings' point of view. And that is because there are so many mounds that have been excavated that don't have any blue clay in them. Meaning that the fact that these 3 ships have survived all the way up until today is actually a really happy coincidence. I really hope you guys have the opportunity to come here in person sometime and see these ships in person. These things are magnificent, and thank you so much for joining me on this tour today. I've had a wonderful time, and I hope you have too. Thank you so much for joining. See you guys.